Sir Stephen Timms.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm very pleased to follow the honourable member for Amber Valley, whose pensions expertise we benefit greatly from on the Work and Pensions Select Committee. But I want just to comment fairly briefly, I think, on two aspects of this bill. Firstly, the decision at a time when the pension burden on ordinary families is rising so fast to give this big tax cut to the wealthiest pension savers. And secondly, to make a comment about the abolition of the Office of Tax Simplification and to reflect on the history of that initiative that's led us to where we are today. Table 4.1 in the Red Book tells us that the abolition of the lifetime pension allowance will cost the government £1.8 billion in uncollected tax over 3 years. And at a time when the tax burden on ordinary families is being raised to the highest level since the Second World War, it seems to me extraordinary that the Chancellor thinks it's right to cut the tax on the 1% largest pension pots. It is a very big challenge for pensions policy that tax relief support for pension saving is so massively skewed in favour of the wealthiest. And there are suggestions from time to time about how to use that relief more progressively to encourage pension saving amongst lower paid workers. But instead, what the Chancellor has done is to make the unfairness £1.8 billion worse. And I find it very difficult to understand how that can be justified. And I do think there is a real problem that chancellors and prime ministers and ministers completely unavoidably spend their time talking to people who are in that 1% wealthiest group. They are the people who can make representations, they're the people they sit next to at their dinners and so on. And in giving a £1.8 billion tax cut to that group, I think the Chancellor has chosen the wrong priority. The Honourable Member for South Thanet made the point in passing, I think quite rightly, that it's creating a very large tax avoidance opportunity for a large number of people, because they won't simply pay the tax which this bill imposes on them. They will instead choose to put now over a lifetime, unlimited amount of money which they can put tax-free into their pension. In the report of the Work and Pensions Select Committee last September on saving for later life, we highlighted the collapse of pension saving amongst self-employed people. In the late 1990s, around about half of self-employed people were saving in a pension. By December 2021, it was down to 16%, compared with 88% of eligible employees, thanks to the success of auto-enrolment. Of course, auto-enrolment isn't available to self-employed people, and pension saving is now at a very low level. We recommended in our report that the Treasury and the DWP should set a date to trial ways to default self-employed people into pension saving, to try and replicate the success of auto-enrolment amongst self-employed people, working out how to replicate the success of auto-enrolment. And actually, £1.8 billion of tax relief could have been a very valuable incentive in making a success of an initiative along those lines. Unfortunately, the government's response to our report rejected our recommendation, and what's happening instead in this bill is that support is being given away to those who already have the largest pension pots. And I find it very difficult to understand how that can possibly be justified. Mr Deputy Speaker, I was elected to the Commons in June 1994, and as is usual, I served on the Finance Bill Committee the following year, and I think some of my recently elected honourable friends will have a similar privilege in the committee on this finance bill as well. And one of the other members of that committee was the Conservative backbencher Tim Smith, who I've no doubt you will remember, Mr Deputy Speaker, who was the MP for Beaconsfield. And he moved an amendment in that committee requiring the Inland Revenue to prepare a report on tax simplification and to lay it before Parliament. To the fury of the Conservative front bench on that committee, he not only moved the amendment, and that's a fairly normal thing to do for a government backbencher to move an amendment, but he pressed it to a vote as well. And of course, all the Labour members of the committee voted in favour of the amendment, and so it won. The bill was amended in committee. Ministers were absolutely livid. This was kind of unheard of for the government to be defeated in the Finance Bill committee. And I don't think the relationship between Tim Smith and his party front bench ever recovered. But within a few weeks, the then Chancellor, Ken Clarke, was making a virtue of the fact that he was going to be bringing forward proposals for tax simplification. And the idea fairly rapidly gained currency. Tim Smith's idea was embraced. The spade work on it was then done by Michael Jack, who became the Financial Secretary in 1995. And what emerged from it, and the Honourable Member for South Thanet mentioned this, was the Tax Law Rewrite Project, which brought forward a series of 5 bills under the Labour governments, which I think did make tax law easier to understand. It certainly did not shorten tax law, but I think it did make it easier to understand. And then the Conservative Party returned to the theme in 2010 with its, I think it was a manifesto commitment to set up the Office of Tax Simplification, which is abolished in this bill. Michael Jack, I think the previous Financial Secretary, I think he was the first chair of the project, and John Whiting of the Chartered Institute of Taxation did a lot of the spade work. And then it was made statutory in 2016, and so we understood this was going to be a permanent feature of the landscape. And I did notice that, having been made statutory in 2016, it had its first quinquennial review in 2021, when the current Prime Minister was the Chancellor, and that review concluded, and I quote, "The need for the OTS's statutory function to advise the Chancellor on simplification of the tax system remains undiminished." And I'm just wondering what's happened in the last 18 months that now it's being abolished. The PricewaterhouseCoopers makes the point that when Tim Smith's amendment was moved in 1995, the volume of tax legislation was 5,000 pages, and his aim was to reduce it. I think the Honourable Member for South Thanet was correct to say that it is now 23,000 pages. So it's certainly not clear that the need for simplification has ended. And I just want to quote what PricewaterhouseCoopers have said about it. They make the point there's been a very high degree of engagement with the tax profession with the work of the Office for Tax Simplification. When it consults on something, it gets lots of ideas and contributions about how to do things. And PwC makes the point, and I quote, "It's produced a number of insightful reports. However," they go on, "the response from the government has been mixed. While some of its recommendations have been accepted, many have been watered down or simply ignored." And I think that's the real reason the Office of Tax Simplification is being abolished, because in the end the government isn't that interested, and there are other priorities which have a higher weight than simplifying the tax system. The closure, of course, was announced in the disastrous mini-budget of last September. I think for that reason alone, we ought to be a bit sceptical about whether it was really a sensible thing to do. The Chancellor said at the time, rather, as the Minister said in her opening speech, the then Chancellor said, I quote, "I have decided to wind down the Office of Tax Simplification and mandated every one of my tax officials to focus on simplifying our tax code." of course, reality, if nobody is responsible, if everybody is responsible for it, then in reality nobody is. And I don't think we're going to see or hear very much progress further on this in the future. It does sound very much like the end of the project. The Honourable lady who chairs the Treasury Select Committee asked about this in her intervention on the Minister earlier. I think she's written on behalf of her committee to the Chancellor to ask why it's being abolished, and I think all of us will be interested to see that reply. I think there is valuable work that's been done by that office, and having sort of followed the progress of this ever since 1995, I'm sorry to see it go, but we'll be interested to hear the Minister's justification for that decision.
Oh.